A millionaire on the brink of death made an unusual request to a homeless girl, pretend to be his daughter for just one day. When she agreed, neither of them expected how this simple arrangement would change their lives forever. What happened next left everyone who witnessed it in tears. Leave a like to keep following our next videos, and don't forget to subscribe to receive more incredible stories like this one. Arthur Menezes sat in the leather chair of his study, watching the perfectly manicured garden of his mansion through the window. The landscape that once seemed imposing now felt empty. He had built his fortune through years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and decisions that weren't always easy. He had raised an empire that guaranteed him respect and power, but now all of that seemed insignificant compared to the paper he held in his hand. The doctor had looked him straight in the eyes, without hesitation, and delivered the news no one wants to hear. A terminal illness left him with only months to live. "I'm sorry, Mr. Menezes. We've done everything possible," the physician had said in a professional tone, though with a hint of humanity in his gaze. Arthur, however, didn't react immediately. He had always been a stoic man, used to controlling any situation, but this time there were no negotiations, no clauses that could save him, just the immovable weight of reality. The mansion, a majestic architectural work that he himself had designed, was now a space as vast as it was silent. The employees carried out their tasks with mechanical precision. Mrs. Irene, the housekeeper, had been working for him for over 30 years, but their relationship was limited to formal greetings and reports about the house's condition. No one asked how he was, and he never offered details. Loneliness was something he had accepted as part of his life for decades, but today it felt like a heavier burden than ever. Arthur remembered the days when everything seemed worthwhile, when his ambition drove him to overcome every obstacle. He had started from the bottom, working as an insurance salesman while studying at night. Every penny he earned was invested in his dreams, and little by little, the man who came from a humble family became one of the most respected figures in the city. But along the way, he had left many things behind: friendships, relationships, and above all, the time to enjoy the fruits of his effort. Now, sitting in that chair, he understood that money had filled his bank account, but never his life. The diagnosis led him to a deep reflection about his final years. He had accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he had no one to share it with. He had no wife, no children. He had never felt the need to start a family, always thinking there would be time for that later. But time, as he now understood, wasn't something he could control. That night, Arthur walked through the mansion. The long hallways decorated with artwork seemed colder than ever. He entered his bedroom and stopped in front of a portrait of himself painted when he was 50. In the image, his expression was that of a confident, invincible man. "How foolish we are when we think we have everything under control," he thought, while letting out a sigh that echoed in the empty room. The next day, Arthur asked not to be disturbed. He spent hours reviewing his schedule, looking at old photographs, and reading letters he had kept in a forgotten drawer. It was as if he was searching for something that would give him back a purpose, even if small. As evening fell, he made a decision that even he found strange. He wanted to experience, at least for one day, what it would be like to have a family. A daughter, specifically. Someone who would fill these silences that surrounded him. Someone with whom he could share a conversation without everything revolving around work or money. Arthur knew he couldn't change the past, but something inside him asked him to try something different, even if for a short time. This idea, as simple as it was improbable, brought him a small ray of hope. For the first time in years, he felt he had something to plan, something that would take him away from the constant thought that his life was coming to an end. "One day won't change anything," he said aloud to himself, "but at least it will be different from this emptiness." With that phrase, Arthur Menezes decided to give his last days a new purpose, though he had no idea how this decision would change, not only his remaining time, but also leave a legacy he never expected to create. The morning began with Arthur driving through downtown, his luxury car drawing occasional glances from passers-by. He had no specific destination in mind. His thoughts were consumed by the strange decision he'd made the night before. As he waited at a traffic light, movement near a small cafe caught his attention. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood outside the cafe's entrance. Her clothes were worn and dirty, her dark hair tangled and unkempt. She held a small box of candies, attempting to sell them to the steady stream of customers entering and leaving the shop. Her voice, though small, was persistent. "Candies, 2 for 5. Please help a little." Most people passed by without even acknowledging her presence, but Arthur found himself unable to look away. There was something in her eyes, a spark of intelligence and resilience that seemed far beyond her years. He watched as she quickly assessed each potential customer, adjusting her approach depending on who she was trying to sell to. When a well-dressed man exited the cafe, she approached him with a forced smile. "Sir, please buy some candies. They're to help me with my things." The man shook his head and continued walking, but the girl didn't let it discourage her. She simply turned to the next person. Arthur pulled his car over to the curb and approached slowly, still unsure exactly what he was going to say. The girl noticed him immediately and straightened her posture, as if she knew she'd found a potential customer. "Would you like some candies, sir? They're good. 2 for 5, she said quickly, showing a pair of brightly colored packages. Arthur, surprised by the firmness in her voice, didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a bill from his wallet and held it out. "How many can I buy with this?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. The girl looked at the bill, and her eyes widened slightly, though she quickly regained her composure. "All of them, sir. You can have the whole box if you want," she responded, calculating that it would be better to take advantage of the opportunity than to negotiate. Arthur smiled slightly, but didn't take the candies. "I didn't come for candies," he said, putting the bill back in his wallet. The girl frowned in confusion. "Then why are you here?" she asked cautiously, taking half a step back. Arthur took a deep breath. "I have a proposal for you. Something different. Do you have a moment to talk?" The girl looked at him with suspicion. "Depends. What do you want?" "Nothing bad, I assure you," Arthur said. "I want you to pretend to be my daughter for 1 day. I'll pay you well, more than you could earn in weeks selling candies." The girl blinked in disbelief. "Pretend to be your daughter? Why would you do that?" Arthur thought for a moment before responding. "Let's say I need company, and you seem suitable for what I have in mind. It's not dangerous. There are no tricks. Just 1 day, and afterward, you can go back to your life." She crossed her arms, clearly distrustful. "And what do you get out of this?" "Peace," Arthur responded with sincerity. "Something I'm lacking, but if you don't want to do it, I understand. You can go." The girl stared at him intently, trying to read his intentions. Finally, she sighed. "If this is a trick, I'll know, but I need the money, so okay, 1 day." Arthur nodded and extended his hand. "Your name?" "Julia," she responded, shaking it. "Good, Julia. I'm Arthur. Let's go. I'll take you somewhere where we can start." Julia followed him cautiously as they walked to his car. The vehicle, though discreet, didn't go unnoticed on the downtown streets. Julia sat in silence, watching out the window, her eyes alert to every turn and street they passed. Arthur noticed her nervousness. "You don't have to worry," he said, breaking the silence. "It's just for 1 day." She didn't respond immediately. Finally, she asked, "What happens after that day?" Arthur smiled weakly. "After that, you can continue with your life and I with mine." Julia wasn't convinced, but decided not to insist. As the car advanced, she began to imagine what this strange man really wanted. Her instincts told her there was something more behind his proposal, but for now, she had no choice but to go along. As they drove up the tree-lined road leading to Arthur's mansion, Julia, sitting in the back seat, looked out the window with a mixture of amazement and caution. She had never been in a place like this. The houses in her neighborhood were small and worn down, a total contrast to the structure now rising before her. When the vehicle stopped in front of the main door, Julia swallowed hard. She had accepted Arthur's proposal, but the magnitude of her decision was only now beginning to hit her. Arthur got out of the car first and turned to her. "Come, I want to show you something," he said, with a calm voice that sought to convey trust. Julia followed Arthur up the marble steps with cautious steps. Though still wary, she couldn't help noticing every detail: the polished marble, the imposing columns, and the stained glass windows that let in the last rays of sunlight. It was like entering another world, one completely foreign to her own. When the door opened, an older woman was waiting for them in the foyer. Her hair was perfectly pulled back in a bun, and she wore an impeccable uniform. Her face showed years of experience and discipline. "Mrs. Irene, this is Julia," Arthur said, as if a child's presence in his mansion was the most normal thing in the world. "She'll be spending the day with us." Irene gave Julia a quick, analyzing look. She didn't say anything at first, but her expression made it clear she wasn't comfortable with the situation. Finally, she nodded slightly and turned to Arthur. "Would you like me to prepare something special for dinner, sir?" "Not yet," Arthur replied. "First, I want Julia to feel comfortable. Show her to her room." Julia's eyes widened in surprise. "A room for me alone?" Arthur smiled slightly. "Of course, it's not for long, but I want you to be comfortable while you're here." Mrs. Irene gestured for her to follow. Julia, still processing everything that was happening, walked behind the woman. The hallway was long, with walls decorated with paintings and golden mirrors. Julia tried not to touch anything, afraid something might break. When they reached the room, Mrs. Irene opened the door, revealing a space that seemed straight out of a magazine. The bed was covered with a white comforter, the curtains were a soft shade, and a large wardrobe occupied one of the walls. This is huge," Julia said, not knowing how to react. "It's just a room," Mrs. Irene responded dryly. "Mr. Meneses said you should be comfortable, so this is where you'll stay." Julia nodded, though she noticed the woman continued to observe her with distrust. "Is there anything else you need?" Mrs. Irene asked, though her tone made it clear she wasn't expecting a positive answer. Julia shook her head. "No, thank you, this is fine." The woman left the room, leaving Julia alone for a few moments. The girl sat on the bed and let out a sigh. She didn't completely understand Arthur's reasons, but she knew she couldn't afford to turn down this opportunity. Later that evening, Mrs. Irene returned with a dress that clearly wasn't Julia's. "This will fit you well," she said, handing over the garment. Julia changed in silence, and when she looked in the mirror, she could barely recognize herself. The dress was elegant but simple, and although she didn't feel completely comfortable, she knew it was part of the deal. When she returned to the hallway, Arthur was waiting for her. He looked at her with a mixture of approval and something she couldn't quite define. "You look nice," he commented. "Now let's go to the living room." Dinner was served in a dining room that seemed designed for grand events. There were chandeliers, fine china, and a table that could accommodate more than 20 people, although only the two of them were there. Julia sat across from Arthur, feeling small compared to everything around her. During dinner, Arthur tried to start a conversation. "Tell me, Julia, what do you like to do when you're not selling candies?" The girl looked up from her plate. "I don't have much time to do anything else. Taking care of my brother takes up most of my day." Arthur nodded, interested. "You have a brother? How old is he?" "7, Julia responded with a slight smile when thinking of him. "His name is Miguel. He's good in school, although we can't always afford it." Julia's words resonated with Arthur more than he expected. He remembered the days of his own childhood when he too had to struggle to get ahead. Although he had buried those memories, now they came back with force, making him question many of his past decisions. Julia, on the other hand, seemed to be carefully observing every reaction from Arthur. She wasn't just a child answering questions, she was analyzing the situation, evaluating what she could get out of all this. She had accepted the deal because she had no other option, but she knew she had to be cautious. "And your parents?" Arthur asked, almost without thinking about it. Julia lowered her gaze. "They're not around," she responded simply. Arthur understood he shouldn't press, but something in her response seemed incomplete, as if she were hiding something. He decided to let the topic go for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind Julia's story than she was letting on. While they finished dinner, Mrs. Irene entered to collect the plates. She observed Julia once more, this time with a more marked interest, though she didn't say anything. It was evident that she didn't trust the girl and was planning to find out more about her. Before leaving for bed, Arthur called Julia to his study. The little girl remained standing, nervous, while Arthur sat behind his desk. "Julia, I want to ask you something," he began, his voice mixing firmness with an unusual gentleness. "Why did you accept my offer? Most children would have been too scared." Julia didn't respond immediately. Her eyes, far too serious for someone her age, studied Arthur carefully before answering. "Because I don't have much choice," she finally said. "And you seem sad, like you need something more than just having someone pretend to be your daughter." Arthur was taken aback by Julia's perceptiveness. Her words had hit closer to home than he'd expected. Before he could respond, Mrs. Irene appeared at the door with an urgent expression. "Mr. Mena says Dr. Wallace is on the phone. He says it's important." Arthur's face tensed slightly. He nodded to Mrs. Irene and turned to Julia. "We'll continue our conversation tomorrow. Get some rest." That night, while Julia slept, Arthur sat in his study reviewing medical reports. His condition was progressing faster than expected, but his mind was elsewhere. There was something about Julia that intrigued him, a maturity in her eyes that seemed to see right through him. The next morning, Julia woke early and found herself drawn to the mansion's library. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, and comfortable reading chairs were scattered throughout the room. She was running her fingers along the spines of some old volumes when Mrs. Irene discovered her. "What are you doing here?" The housekeeper's voice was sharp with suspicion. "I like to read," Julia replied simply, not backing down from Mrs. Irene's stern gaze. "When I can find books anyway." Mrs. Irene's expression softened slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected response. Before she could say anything else, Arthur appeared in the doorway. "Good morning, Julia. I see you found the library." He smiled, noting her interest in the books. "Do you have a favorite author?" Julia shook her head. "I read whatever I can find. But I like stories about people who overcome difficult things." Arthur watched as she carefully handled an old leather-bound volume. "You seem comfortable with books for someone so young." "Books don't judge you," she replied, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. "They don't care if your clothes are old or if you haven't eaten that day. They just share their stories." The simplicity and depth of her answer struck both adults into silence. Mrs. Irene excused herself, but not before giving Julia a slightly different look than before, one tinged with something approaching respect. Over breakfast, Arthur noticed Julia studying everything around her with careful attention. She wasn't just looking, she was observing, analyzing, memorizing details. It reminded him of himself at a younger age, always trying to understand how things worked, always planning ahead. "Julia," he began carefully, "you mentioned your brother yesterday. Tell me more about him." Her face lit up at the mention of Miguel, though she maintained her guard. "He's smart, really smart. He can already read better than most kids in his class when we can afford to send him. He likes to draw too, especially buildings. He says one day he'll build beautiful houses for people who don't have them." As she spoke about her brother, Arthur noticed something change in her demeanor. The careful, calculating look in her eyes was replaced by genuine warmth and pride. But there was also worry there, the kind no child should have to carry. "It must be hard, taking care of him by yourself," Arthur prompted gently. Julia's expression became guarded again. "We manage. I do what I have to do." Arthur was about to ask another question when he noticed Julia staring at something behind him. He turned to see what had caught her attention. It was a photograph on the wall, one he usually barely noticed anymore. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing in front of his first office building. "That was you?" Julia asked, curiosity overtaking her usual caution. "Yes, about 25 years ago, when I was just starting out. You look different," she observed. "Happier." The comment struck Arthur like a physical blow. He looked at the photograph again, really looked at it for the first time in years. The man in the picture was smiling broadly, eyes full of hope and determination. When was the last time he'd smiled like that? "I suppose I was," he admitted quietly. Just then, Mrs. Irene entered with a concerned expression. "Sir, Mr. Richardson from the board is here. He says it's urgent." Arthur frowned. He wasn't expecting any visits, especially not from Richardson. Something must have happened at the company. He turned to Julia apologetically. "I need to take care of this. Mrs. Irene will show you around the gardens if you'd like." Julia nodded, but as Arthur left the room, he caught a glimpse of her expression. She was watching him with those observant eyes again, as if she could sense something wasn't quite right. In his study, Richardson was pacing nervously. "Arthur, there's something you need to know. The board, they're planning something. They've been meeting secretly, discussing your condition." Arthur felt his jaw tighten. "How did they find out?" "That's not important right now. What's important is they're trying to force an emergency succession plan. They're worried about the company's stability." As Richardson continued explaining the situation, Arthur found his thoughts drifting to Julia in the garden. Here was another reminder that his time was running out, that everything he'd built could crumble. Yet somehow, the company's fate didn't seem as pressing as it would have just days ago. Through the window, he could see Julia walking with Mrs. Irene in the garden. The girl had stopped to examine a rosebush, and to his surprise, he saw Mrs. Irene bend down to explain something to her. The usually stern housekeeper was actually smiling. "Arthur, are you listening?" Richardson's voice brought him back to the present. "Yes, I heard you. The board wants me out before I become a liability." He turned back to face Richardson. "Tell them I'll meet with them tomorrow. I have something more important to attend to today." Richardson looked shocked. "More important? Arthur, this is your company we're talking about." "Yes," Arthur replied calmly, "and it will still be there tomorrow. Now, if you'll excuse me, I promise to show my guest the greenhouse." After Richardson left, Arthur joined Julia in the garden. She was kneeling beside a flower bed, carefully examining a cluster of purple blooms. Mrs. Irene stood nearby, explaining something about seasonal plantings. Her usual stern demeanor softened slightly. "These are irises," Julia said without looking up as Arthur approached. "Mrs. Irene says they bloom, even when the weather isn't good. They're survivors." Arthur noticed how she emphasized that last word, as if it held special meaning. "Yes, they are. Would you like to see more? The greenhouse has quite a collection." As they walked toward the greenhouse, Arthur noticed Julia limping slightly. "Are you all right?" She tried to hide it, straightening her posture. "It's nothing. My shoes sometimes hurt when I walk too much." Arthur looked down at her worn shoes, clearly several sizes too small, something twisted in his chest. Here he was, surrounded by wealth, while this child couldn't even afford proper shoes. Inside the greenhouse, Julia's discomfort seemed forgotten as she marveled at the variety of plants. Her questions were precise and thoughtful, showing an intelligence that continued to surprise Arthur. As she examined a particularly vibrant orchid, she suddenly asked, "Why are you sick?" The question caught Arthur off guard. "How did you know?" "I hear things," she said simply. "The way Mrs. Irene talks to you sometimes, like she's worried. And those pills on your nightstand, they're the same kind my friend Sarah's mom took before she died." Arthur felt a chill run through him. This child noticed everything. "It's a complicated illness," he said finally. "The doctors are doing their best, but they can't fix it," Julia finished for him. She turned to face him fully. Is that why you wanted someone to pretend to be your daughter? Because you're running out of time? The directness of her question, delivered in that childish voice, yet carrying such adult understanding, made Arthur's throat tight. Before he could respond, Mrs. Irene appeared at the greenhouse door. "Sir, there's a call from the hospital. They say it's about your test results." Arthur nodded, but as he turned to leave, Julia spoke again. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know about time running out." He looked back at her, struck by the sadness in her eyes. What had this child seen in her short life to understand such things? The call from the hospital was brief but devastating. His condition was progressing more rapidly than expected. Weeks, not months. Arthur sat in his study afterward, staring at the test results without really seeing them. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Julia stood there, holding something behind her back. "Mrs. Irene said you might need this," she said, bringing forward a cup of tea. "She says it helps when people are sad." Arthur accepted the cup, noticing how carefully she carried it, trying not to spill a drop. "Thank you, Julia. Would you like to sit with me for a while?" She climbed into one of the large leather chairs, her feet barely reaching the edge. For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. "Tell me about Miguel," Arthur said finally. "What's he like?" Julia's face brightened, as it always did when discussing her brother. "He's special. He sees things differently than most people. Even when things are really bad, he finds reasons to smile." She paused, then added more quietly, "He asks about our mom sometimes. I don't always know what to tell him." "What happened to your mother?" Arthur asked gently. Julia looked down at her hands. She had to go away. She said it was to protect us, but I don't really understand from what or who." She looked up suddenly, her eyes sharp. "Kind of like how you're not telling me everything about why I'm really here." Before Arthur could respond, a commotion arose from the front of the house. Mrs. Irene's voice could be heard, unusually agitated, along with another, unfamiliar voice growing increasingly loud. "Sir," Mrs. Irene appeared at the study door, looking flustered. "There's a man here. He says he's Julia's father." The color drained from Julia's face. She leaped from the chair, suddenly looking terrified. "He's not my father," she whispered urgently. "He's lying. Please don't let him in." Arthur stood, placing himself between Julia and the door. "Mrs. Irene, call security immediately." But before she could move, a tall man pushed past her into the study. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, and his eyes had a dangerous gleam. "There you are, you little brat," he snarled. "Do you know how long I've been looking for you?" Julia pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. Arthur stepped forward, his voice cold with authority. "I don't know who you are, sir, but you're trespassing. Leave now, or I'll have you removed." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think so. You see, I have legal papers here showing I'm Julia's guardian, and I've come to take her home." The tension in the study was palpable as Arthur studied the man claiming to be Julia's guardian. Years of business negotiations had taught him to read people, and everything about this man set off warning bells. "These papers," Arthur said calmly, holding out his hand. "May I see them?" The man pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, presenting it with an arrogant flourish. As Arthur examined the paperwork, he noticed Julia slowly edging toward the door, her eyes never leaving the man. "These seem to be in order," Arthur admitted, though something about the documents felt off. "However, given Julia's obvious distress at your presence, I think we should contact the proper authorities to verify everything." The man's confident smile faltered slightly. "That won't be necessary. I'm taking her now." "Mr. Meneses," Mrs. Irene's voice came from the doorway. "Security is on their way, and I've taken the liberty of calling the police." The man's demeanor changed instantly. His fake smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "This isn't your business." "You made it my business when you forced your way into my home," Arthur replied evenly. He glanced at Julia, who had managed to position herself behind Mrs. Irene. "And I think you should explain why a child who's supposedly in your care is terrified of you. That brat's been filling your head with lies," the man spat. "She's good at that. Her and her brother both." Julia's head snapped up. "Where's Miguel? What did you do to him?" The man's laugh was cold. "Oh, now you care about your precious brother. Don't worry, he's safe, for now. But if you don't come with me right now, that's enough." Arthur's voice cut through the room like steel. "You've just threatened a child in front of witnesses. I suggest you leave before the police arrive." Security finally appeared at the door, 2 large men in dark suits. The man looked around, realizing he was outnumbered. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward the door. "You don't know what you're getting involved in." After he was escorted out, Julia collapsed into a chair, shaking. Mrs. Irene immediately went to her side, all previous suspicion forgotten in the face of the child's distress. "Julia," Arthur said gently, kneeling beside her chair despite the protest of his aching body, "I need you to tell me the truth. Who was that man? And what does he want with you and Miguel?" Julia looked at him with tears in her eyes. "His name is Frank. He runs things on the streets. He finds kids like me and Miguel, kids without anyone to protect them, makes us work for him." Arthur felt his blood run cold. "Work how?" "Selling things, candy sometimes, but other things too. Things we're not supposed to know about." Julia wiped her eyes angrily. "If we don't bring in enough money, he gets mad. Really mad." Mrs. Irene made a small, distressed sound. "Those bruises I saw when you were changing, that was him?" Julia nodded slightly. "Miguel and I tried to run away last week. We'd been saving money, planning it for months, but he caught Miguel. I got away, but—" Her voice broke. "I've been trying to figure out how to get my brother back." Arthur stood slowly, his mind racing. "Those Guardian papers, they're forged, aren't they?" "Has to be. Our mom." Julia hesitated. "Before she disappeared, she left documents with someone she trusted. She said they'd keep us safe, prove that Frank had no right to us. But we never found them." "Disappeared?" Arthur prompted gently. 3 years ago. She was trying to get evidence against Frank about what he makes the kids do. Then one day she just didn't come home." Julia's voice was barely a whisper now. "The police didn't look very hard. Frank has friends everywhere." Arthur shared a look with Mrs. Irene, who had tears in her eyes. The housekeeper had completely transformed from her earlier suspicious demeanor, now holding Julia's hand protectively. "Sir," she said, her voice firm, "we cannot let that man take her." "We won't," Arthur assured them both. "But we need to find Miguel." "I know where Frank keeps the kids," Julia said, sitting up straighter. "But it's guarded, and he moves them around a lot." "Let me make some calls," Arthur said, reaching for his phone. "I may not have friends in the same places Frank does, but I have resources he can't imagine." As he dialed, however, his hand trembled slightly, a reminder of his condition. The doctor's words from earlier echoed in his mind. Weeks, not months. He pushed the thought away. Time might be running out for him, but he could still make it count. "Julia," he said, waiting for his lawyer to answer, "I promise you we're going to get your brother back. And then we're going to make sure Frank can never hurt another child." What he didn't say was that this might be his last chance to do something truly meaningful with his wealth and influence. Looking at Julia's hopeful face, he knew that all his years of accumulating power and connections had been leading to this moment. The next few hours in the mansion were filled with intense activity. Arthur's study had become a command center of sorts, with his lawyer, James Peterson, and 2 private investigators discussing strategy. Julia sat quietly in a corner, exhausted but refusing to rest until they had a plan to save Miguel. "The building is officially abandoned," one of the investigators explained, pointing to photos spread across Arthur's desk. "But there's regular activity at night. Local police have been called multiple times, but nothing ever comes of it." "Because Frank pays them off," Julia interjected, her voice bitter with knowledge no child should possess. Arthur watched her from his chair, fighting another wave of fatigue. The day's events had taken a toll on his already weakened body, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. "James," he addressed his lawyer, "what are our legal options?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses, frowning at the documents before him. "With Julia's testimony and these forged guardianship papers, we can get the authorities involved. But Frank's connections could complicate things. We need something more concrete." "What about my mum's documents?" Julia asked suddenly. "The ones she hid before she disappeared." Everyone turned to look at her. "Do you know where they might be?" Arthur asked gently. Julia hesitated. "Maybe. Mom used to work at a library downtown. She was friends with the head librarian, Miss Sarah. Before she disappeared, I remember her talking to Miss Sarah about keeping something safe." Arthur nodded to one of the investigators, who immediately made a note. "We'll look into it first thing in the morning." "No," Julia protested, standing up. "It has to be now. Frank will know I told you everything. He might move Miguel or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Irene, who had been quietly bringing coffee to everyone, placed a protective hand on Julia's shoulder. "The child is right, sir. We can't wait." Arthur felt another spell of dizziness but forced himself to focus. "James, get me Judge Montgomery on the phone. Sarah," he turned to the female investigator, "take your team to the library. Find this Miss Sarah and any documents she might have." As people began moving with renewed purpose, Arthur noticed Julia swaying slightly on her feet. Despite her determination to stay awake, exhaustion was finally catching up with her. "Julia," he said softly, "you need to rest." She shook her head stubbornly. "I can't. Not while Miguel—" "Listen to me," Arthur interrupted, moving to kneel in front of her, despite the pain it caused him. "I promise you, everyone here will keep working, but you need to be strong for when we find Miguel. He'll need his big sister." Mrs. Irene stepped forward. "Come, child. I'll stay with you and we'll wake you the moment there's news." Finally, Julia allowed herself to be led away, but at the door she turned back. "Mr. Meneses, thank you for believing me." After she left, Arthur sank back into his chair, his breathing labored. James noticed immediately. "Arthur, you should rest too. Your condition—" "My condition is precisely why we can't waste time," Arthur cut him off. "How long until we hear from Judge Montgomery?" Before James could answer, Arthur's phone buzzed. The message was from his doctor. "Need to see you immediately. Test results concerning." Arthur ignored it. He had made his choice. Whatever time he had left would be spent making sure Julia and Miguel were safe. An hour later, Sarah returned with unexpected news. "We found Miss Sarah the librarian," she reported. "She's been waiting years for Julia or Miguel to come looking for these." She placed a thick envelope on Arthur's desk. Inside were documents that made Arthur's breath catch, detailed records of Frank's operation, including financial transactions, names of corrupted officials, and most importantly, proof that Julia and Miguel's mother had legal arrangements for their care, arrangements that specifically excluded Frank. "There's more," Sarah said quietly. "We also found letters. Their mother, she knew Frank was onto her. She arranged everything before she disappeared, including—" Sarah glanced at James meaningfully. "Including what?" Arthur demanded. "Including a request that you, specifically, be contacted if anything happened to her. She used to work for your company, Arthur, in the accounting department. She discovered irregularities, money being funneled to Frank's operations through shell companies." Arthur felt the room spin, and this time it wasn't from his illness. "What was her name?" he whispered. "Maria Santiago. She disappeared 3 years ago after trying to report the corruption she'd found." Arthur remembered her now. A quiet, efficient employee who had resigned unexpectedly. He had been too busy, too focused on his empire to notice or question her departure. The weight of his negligence hit him like a physical blow. Just then, the second investigator burst into the study. "We found Miguel," he announced breathlessly. "But we need to move fast. Frank's men are loading vehicles. They're planning to move the kids tonight." Arthur stood, steadying himself against the desk. Call Judge Montgomery again. Tell him we have the evidence. And get me Detective Chen. He's one of the few honest cops I know in this city. It's time to end this. As his team sprang into action, Arthur glanced at the family photo of Maria Santiago, included in the documents. In it, she smiled proudly between a younger Julia and Miguel. He made a silent promise to her and to himself. He would finish what she had started, no matter the cost. Detective Chen arrived at the mansion within 30 minutes of Arthur's call. Unlike the usual police responses to complaints about Frank, Chen's reputation for integrity was well known. He studied the documents spread across Arthur's desk with growing concern. "This is bigger than just child exploitation," Chen said, pointing to the financial records. "These shell companies, the corrupted officials, Frank's operation has tentacles everywhere. Which is why we need to move now," Arthur insisted, fighting another wave of dizziness, "before he can move the children or destroy more evidence." Mrs. Irene appeared at the door. "Sir, Julia's awake. She's asking about Miguel." Arthur nodded. "Bring her in. She needs to hear this." Julia entered, looking small but determined. The few hours of sleep had restored some of her energy, but fear for her brother still showed in her eyes. "We found Miguel," Arthur told her gently, "and we're going to get him out tonight." "I'm coming with you," Julia stated immediately. "Absolutely not," Arthur and Mrs. Irene said simultaneously. "But I know the building," Julia protested. "I know where Frank keeps the kids, which doors have alarms, everything." Detective Chen stepped forward. "Julia, what would help us most is if you could draw us a map. Can you do that?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. As she worked with Chen's team, sketching the building's layout and marking important details, Arthur watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. Her knowledge might save her brother, but it also showed just how much she'd been forced to grow up too fast. "The back entrance," Julia explained, pointing to her drawing. "That's where they bring in supplies. It's usually only guarded by one person, and the camera there hasn't worked in months." Chen nodded approvingly. "This is excellent, Julia. This will help us get the children out safely." Arthur's lawyer, James, entered with more news. "Judge Montgomery signed the warrants. We have full authorization for the raid and emergency custody orders for all the children they find." "Good," Arthur said, but his voice was weaker than before. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to stay upright as another spell of dizziness hit him. Mrs. Irene noticed immediately. "Sir, you need to sit down. Your medication—" "There's no time," Arthur cut her off, though he did sink into his chair. "Detective, how soon can you move? My team's already in position. We're just waiting for backup from trusted precincts outside Frank's influence." Julia suddenly appeared at Arthur's side, her small hand touching his arm. "You're getting worse," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Arthur tried to smile reassuringly, but the effort seemed to drain him further. "I'm fine. What matters is getting Miguel and the other children to safety." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "But you're not fine, just like Mom wasn't fine when—" She stopped, her voice breaking. Arthur took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Julia, listen to me. Sometimes the most important things we do in life have to be done even when we're not at our strongest. Your mother understood that. She tried to protect you and Miguel, and now it's our turn to finish what she started." Detective Chen's phone buzzed. After checking it, he looked up with renewed urgency. "Backup's in place. We move in 20 minutes. "I'm coming to the command center," Arthur declared, attempting to stand. "Sir," Mrs. Irene protested, The doctor said I have weeks," Arthur replied bluntly, causing Julia to gasp. "But these children don't have weeks. They need help now." Julia stepped closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't die. Not like Mom." The raw pain in her voice struck Arthur to his core. He knelt down to her level, ignoring the protest of his failing body. "Julia, I promise you, no matter what happens to me, you and Miguel will be safe. I've made all the arrangements. Mrs. Irene will stay with you, and James has papers ready to ensure you'll be taken care of. "But that's not what I want," Julia cried. "I want you to stay. You're the first person since Mom who really sees us, who understands." Her words were interrupted by Chen's radio crackling to life. Movement at the target location, multiple vehicles preparing to depart. Arthur struggled to his feet. "We're out of time. Julia, stay with Mrs. Irene. Detective, let's go." As they headed for the door, Julia called out one last time, "Mr. Meneses." When he turned, she ran to him, hugging him fiercely. "Thank you for everything." Arthur held her close for a moment, then gently disentangled himself. As he walked out to the waiting car, he could feel his strength ebbing. But looking back at Julia standing in the doorway with Mrs. Irene, he knew he had to see this through. In the car, he pulled out his phone and sent a final message to his doctor. "I know the risks, but some things are worth dying for." The command center had been set up in a vacant office building across from Frank's operation. Arthur sat near the window, watching as Detective Chen's teams moved into position. Despite the medication Mrs. Irene had insisted he take before leaving, every breath felt like a struggle. "They're moving the first group of kids to the vans," one of Chen's officers reported through the radio. "Count is approximately 12 children. Ages look to be between 6 and 13. Arthur leaned forward, scanning the scene below. "Do you see Miguel?" "Not in the first group, sir." The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Arthur's doctor had warned him that stress would accelerate his condition, and he could feel the truth of those words in every labored heartbeat. But he couldn't leave, not until he knew Miguel was safe. "Movement at the back entrance," another officer reported. "Second group of children. Wait, there's a disturbance inside." Through the window, Arthur could see sudden activity around the building's rear door. Shouts echoed across the street, followed by the sound of breaking glass. "They're running!" The radio crackled with urgency. "Multiple children attempting to flee through the loading dock. Suspect is in pursuit." Arthur's heart nearly stopped as he spotted a small figure darting between the vehicles. A boy who looked just like the photo Julia had shown him. Miguel. "That's him," Arthur said into the radio. "The boy in the blue shirt. That's Miguel." Everything happened at once. Frank emerged from the building, reaching for Miguel, but Chen's teams were already moving in. The detective himself tackled Frank before he could grab the boy, while other officers secured the scene and began gathering the children. Arthur tried to stand, wanting to go down to the street, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His vision swam, and he could hear his pulse pounding in his ears. "Sir?" One of the officers looked at him with concern. "Are you all right?" Before Arthur could answer, his chest seized with pain. He was dimly aware of someone calling for an ambulance as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. His last conscious thought was of Julia's face and his promise to bring her brother home. He awoke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and the sensation of a small hand holding his. Opening his eyes slowly, he found Julia curled up in a chair beside his bed, fast asleep. On a small couch against the wall, Miguel was also sleeping, wrapped in what looked like one of Mrs. Irene's handmade blankets. "They refused to leave." Mrs. Irene's soft voice came from the doorway. She entered, carrying a fresh cup of water. "Even after the doctors said you needed rest." Arthur tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Mrs. Irene helped him take a few sips of water before continuing. The operation was a complete success. Detective Chen arrested Frank and several of his associates. They found enough evidence in the building to ensure he'll never hurt another child. "The other children?" Arthur managed to whisper. "All safe. Social services is working to locate their families. Those without families are being placed in proper care facilities, ones that have been thoroughly vetted." She smiled slightly. "Judge Montgomery is personally overseeing everything." Julia stirred at the sound of their voices, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Arthur was awake, she sat up straight, her face lighting up with relief. "You're okay," she exclaimed, then immediately lowered her voice, glancing at her still sleeping brother. "The doctors said your heart almost stopped, but they fixed it. They said you need to rest for a long time, though." Arthur squeezed her hand weakly. Miguel, is he... He's okay, Julia assured him quickly. He was scared at first, but Mrs. Irene made him hot chocolate and told him stories about when you were younger. She grinned. I didn't know you used to climb trees and get in trouble. Mrs. Irene has a very selective memory, Arthur muttered, but he was smiling too. Miguel chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepily at the room. When he saw Julia, he smiled, but his expression turned shy when he noticed Arthur was awake. Miguel, Julia called softly, come here. This is Mr. Meneses. He's the one who helped us. The boy approached the bed cautiously. Up close, Arthur could see traces of their mother in his features, just as he saw them in Julia. But where Julia's eyes held years of forced maturity, Miguel's still carried a child's innocence, preserved perhaps by his sister's fierce protection. Thank you for helping my sister, Miguel said quietly, and for getting me away from the bad place. Arthur felt tears prickle at the corners of his eyes. You're both very brave, he told them. Just like your mother was. Julia's eyes widened. You knew about Mom? Arthur nodded slowly. We found out everything. She worked for my company once. She tried to stop Frank's operation years ago, tried to protect other children like you. She left documents proving you and Miguel should never have been under Frank's control. Tears rolled down Julia's cheeks. So she didn't just leave us. She was really trying to help. She was a hero, Arthur confirmed, and she made arrangements to keep you safe. He paused, looking at Mrs. Irene, who nodded encouragingly. She actually asked for me to be contacted if anything happened to her. I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner. I was too busy with my own life to notice what was happening right in front of me. Miguel had moved closer to his sister, taking her hand. What happens to us now? He asked, his voice small but steady. Arthur took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his chest. That depends on what you want. I've made arrangements for you both to be taken care of, no matter what. But 2 weeks had passed since the night of the rescue. Arthur's hospital room had gradually transformed into something almost homely, with children's drawings covering the walls and a small collection of books piled on the bedside table. Despite his doctor's grave predictions, his condition had stabilized, not improving, but not worsening as rapidly as they'd feared. On this particular morning, James arrived with a stack of papers, his expression unusually nervous. Are you sure about this, Arthur? It's a big responsibility, especially given your condition. I've never been more sure of anything, Arthur replied, reaching for the papers. His hand trembled slightly, but his signature was firm and clear on each page. Mrs. Irene knocked softly, before entering with Julia and Miguel. The children had been staying at the mansion under her care, visiting Arthur daily. Today, they seemed to sense something important was happening. Come sit, Arthur patted the edge of his bed. As they settled in, he noticed how different they looked from just 2 weeks ago. Regular meals and peaceful sleep had brought color to their cheeks. Miguel no longer flinched at sudden movements, and Julia's eyes had lost some of their haunted look. I have something important to ask you both, Arthur began. As you know, your mother made arrangements for your care. She wanted to make sure you'd be safe and provided for. He paused, gathering strength. What she couldn't have known was how much meeting you would change my life. Julia reached for his hand, a gesture that had become natural over their time together. Arthur squeezed it gently before continuing. I've spent my whole life acquiring things, money, power, influence, but I never understood what really mattered until I met you. Your courage, your love for each other, the way you faced impossible challenges. You've taught me more about what's important than all my years in business ever did. He looked at James, who handed him the final document. This is an adoption petition. If you want, only if you want, I'd like to make our arrangement permanent. I want to be your family, legally and in every other way. The room fell silent. Miguel looked at Julia, waiting for his sister's reaction. She had been their protector for so long, it was natural for him to follow her lead. Julia's voice trembled slightly when she spoke. But your illness, Yes, Arthur acknowledged. I'm still sick. The doctors say I have more time than they initially thought, but he took a deep breath. I won't lie to you. I don't know how long I have, but I've made arrangements. Mrs. Irene has agreed to stay on as your guardian if anything happens to me. The mansion will be your home for as long as you want it. Your education, your future, everything will be provided for. He looked at Mrs. Irene, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. More importantly, you'll have people who love you. Mrs. Irene, James, Detective Chen, they've all come to care about you as much as I do. Miguel spoke up, his voice small but clear. Could we still call you Mr. Meneses? At least for now. Arthur felt his heart swell. You can call me whatever makes you comfortable. What matters is that you feel safe and loved. Julia was crying now, but they were different tears from the ones he'd seen before. Mom would have liked you, she said. She always said that real family isn't about blood. It's about who's willing to stand by you when things are hard. She looked at her brother, who nodded eagerly. Then she threw her arms around Arthur's neck, careful of his medical equipment but holding tight all the same. Yes, she whispered. Yes, we want to stay. Miguel joined the hug, and for a moment Arthur's illness, the pain, the uncertainty of the future, all of it faded away. Mrs. Irene was openly crying now, and even James looked suspiciously misty-eyed. Later that evening, after the paperwork was filed and the children had gone home with Mrs. Irene, Arthur sat alone in his hospital room. He picked up the photo of Maria Santiago that he'd kept on his bedside table. I'll take care of them, he promised her quietly. Not just with money or things, but with all the love they deserve. And I'll make sure they never forget how brave their first mother was. A nurse came in to check his vitals, remarking with surprise that they were stronger than they'd been in days. Arthur wasn't surprised at all. He had found something worth fighting for, worth living for, however much time he had left. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought about how he'd started this journey, thinking he was giving a lonely child one day of family. Instead, that child, and her brother, had given him something far more precious. They had given him a reason to make every remaining day count. In the mansion, Julia and Miguel were getting ready for bed. Mrs. Irene had just finished reading them a story, something that was becoming a nightly ritual. Do you think Mr. Meneses will be okay? Miguel asked his sister as Mrs. Irene tucked him in. Julia looked at the family photo Mrs. Irene had placed on their bedside table, one taken just that morning, with all of them crowded around Arthur's hospital bed, smiling. It wasn't a perfect photo. Arthur looked tired, Miguel's hair was messy, and Julia's eyes were red from crying. But they were together, and they were happy. I think, Julia said slowly, that sometimes when you love people, they stay with you forever, even if they can't stay in person. Mom taught us that, but right now we have Mr. Meneses and Mrs. Irene and each other, and that's more than enough. Mrs. Irene kissed them both goodnight, then paused at the door. Your mother would be so proud of you both, she said softly, and so is Mr. Meneses. So am I. As the lights dimmed, Julia and Miguel held hands across the space between their beds, a habit they'd developed during their hardest times. But tonight, instead of holding on out of fear, they held on in gratitude, secure in the knowledge that they had finally found their way home.